was the longest manhunt in American history. For nearly 18 years, the individual known as the Unabomber stayed one step ahead of law enforcement authorities as he left a trail of death and grisly injuries around the country. By the time the FBI tracked him to his hideout in the Montana wilderness in 1996, Ted Kaczynski, a one-time math professor, had killed 3 people and maimed 23 others. His signature, a bomb placed carefully in plain wrapping and sent through the mail. Victims seemed random: a computer scientist, an airline president, an advertising executive, a timber industry lobbyist. But as we eventually learned from Kaczynski's diary, they symbolized for him the evil grip that technology, he called them techno-nerds, had on U.S. society. Today, Kaczynski is serving 8 concurrent life sentences in a federal maximum security prison in Colorado. He can no longer do anyone harm. But his story still matters to those who worry about domestic terrorism and whether we're capable of dealing with the so-called lone wolf terrorist. The long struggle to find the Unabomber also parallels an equally difficult battle to change the FBI culture and bureaucracy, with effects that have lasted to this day. The details of that internal battle have been revealed for the first time in a book called Unabomber: How the FBI Broke Its Own Rules to Capture the Terrorist Ted Kaczynski. We're pleased to have with us 2 of the authors, retired FBI agents Jim Freeman and Donald Max Noel. Along with a third co-author, Terry Churchy, who couldn't be with us today, they led the team that brought Kaczynski to justice. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
So let's start with the obvious. The title of your book is a mouthful. What did you mean to imply by breaking the rules, changing the FBI culture? What actually were you getting at?
Well, the book is about breaking the rules, or actually addressing the problems that were obstacles to us in the investigation. It's not like we started out to change the FBI. It just happened along the way because we really solved problems as we went. And they were monumental problems of dealing with an organization and a bureaucracy that was never really envisioned that it would handle this type of a case.
Well, the FBI was a pretty efficient organization, presumably before the Unabomber case began. So what was needed in terms of change?
Communications was a big problem, and record keeping, and the manner in which the field offices were decentralized and agents were given a case to investigate, and then they would run that case, and they would send leads to other field offices to handle and report that information back to them, that worked for like 99% of all FBI investigations at the time. But Unabomber was such that it didn't happen. Unabomber, any type of bombing like that is the premise of it from an investigator standpoint is responding to the scene, gathering the low-hanging fruit. Was there an eyewitness? Did anybody see a license plate number of the perpetrator?
Classic police investigation.
Classic police investigation. It didn't happen here for 16 years. By the time we got involved in this case, there was bits and pieces of information. Witnesses had been identified in some cases and interviewed, and not in others. So it really entailed having to go back and take a comprehensive look at all of the investigation over the 16 years. Max was instrumental in doing this and going out to other field offices to look at their records, and there was inconsistency of the record keeping. We had 3 federal agencies involved. They all kept their records in a different manner. None of it was co-located in a central. The computers didn't hardly exist at the time in law enforcement, or at least in the FBI.
Low tech, so to speak.
Low tech.
This is something that was talked about a lot after 9/11, the need for interoperability among agencies, different law enforcement agencies, and that was a problem in spades, I imagine, as this investigation started to go bigger and bigger and bigger.
Well, as Jim said, one of the biggest difficulties was the traditional manner in which the FBI handled cases. And this case, people have to understand, the case file was 59,000 volumes of information. It was difficult enough for those of us who were working at 24 hours a day full time to digest and have knowledge of all of that. But when a bomb would go off at Yale University, for instance, Dr. David Galanter, and the poor resident agent up there a gentleman named Ron Barndollar, absolutely a great agent. He didn't have the institutional knowledge necessary to conduct the investigation in a thorough fashion. So we needed to have task force people who were knowledgeable to go and assist him in the information, in the investigation that he was conducting. And that happened time and time again. And the Bureau wasn't set up to do that. And special agents in charge like Jim got very parochial in their viewpoint when outsiders from other divisions of the FBI would come into their division and attempt to conduct investigation because they weren't under their direct control. So that had to be changed.
I don't think a lot of people understand the structure of how the FBI is set up with special agents in charge, but if I remember from the book, you were about ready to leave this case before Jim came along.
I wanted to leave the case. Everybody wanted to leave the case.
Why?
It was a dead-end case, and it was just because of those problems. Sending off. In the beginning of the case, we had indented writing on a letter that went to the New York Times, said, call Nathan R. Wednesday, 7 p.m. And no one at the New York Times acknowledged having taken such a note. So we needed to identify who Nathan R. was because it appeared that the Unabomber had written that note to himself. We identified everyone in the United States named Nathan or any derivative thereof and a last name beginning in R.
That would have been a bit of a job.
It was 8,900 of them. Then we identified every one of those Nathan R's who lived in an area that we knew the Unabomber had contact with or was interested in, and there were over 3,300 of them. And then we began to send leads out to have those people interviewed about knowledge of who they thought the Unabomber might be, with the composite drawing, the initial composite drawing, and what have you. Okay, that was a extremely labor-intensive program. So we would send those leads off to other divisions. This was a major case. A major case in the FBI has a specific connotation about funding and the way leads are covered and handled and deadlines and all of that kind of stuff. It just doesn't mean it's a big case. That's a specific term in the Bureau. In a major case, leads are to be handled within 10 days and forwarded back to the Office of Origin, San Francisco. We would send the Nathan R. leads out and other divisions wouldn't respond to them. And they would just sit there for months on end.
So that was a rule that wasn't broken, it just wasn't followed.
It wasn't followed. So we would pick the phone up as agents and call those divisions, and I called several personally and said, hey, we need these leads back. And they said, hey, our SAC sets the priority in our division. We'll do those leads when we get to them. And that's one of the things that I brought up to Director Free in a meeting that we had in December that needed addressing.
That's
and he addressed it.
Louis Free at the time,
yes,
the director
Free,
of the FBI.
and Director Free addressed that problem. And he went out and held every SAC personally accountable to him to ensure that those leads were conducted in the time frame that they were supposed to be conducted in. Because the Bureau, as it evolved, gave a lot more autonomy to SACs within their divisions.
So that was one of the interesting things I took from your book, that you really used the director, Louis Free, at the time, as the fellow who helped you break those rules.
Jim forged a very close relationship with
him
Director
Cloud
Free.
Cover.
Yeah.
Well, that was very interesting, the fact that we found, and I had no prior relationship with Director Free before I volunteered for this case. I was special agent in charge. I had my own office in San Francisco, but the task force was already co-located there, and the people that were running it were getting ready to disband and go back to their own careers and their own offices, and so some change had to take place. So I volunteered. If it's going to be here adjacent to my office, I want to run it, and so I volunteered and went back to meet with Louis Free, and I said, what I really need is, if I'm going to do this, I need some autonomy over all of the other SACs and your executive staff at headquarters. You really have to allow me to have some leeway, and I need resources and all. And we talked about that, and he agreed that that was necessary. And it became clear to me over a period of time that he was having these same problems within trying to redirect the FBI into a different type of organization to get away from the old ways.
You met with him at various times in Washington, D.C., and really found out that he was really pushing you guys to break some of those rules, in effect, and change the culture.
He
And Janet Reno, by the way. It was
Yes,
his
both.
Absolutely. And he gave me direct access to the deputy director of the FBI to solve problems if he wasn't available. And it worked very well, but it was totally not the way a traditional FBI investigation is handled. But after a case has gone on for 16 years, it's time to break some rules and shake things up.
I would imagine.
And Louis was willing to do that.
You had Kaczynski was listed as suspect 2416, if I remember correctly, in your books.
Yes.
How many suspects did you actually go through before you?
2,417.
Is that right?
Actual suspects, not people of interest, not people we thought, but people who we thoroughly believed could possibly be the Unabomber. And we had suspect files open on every one of them. So every time there was a letter mailed or a bomb sent or a bomb placed, we had to get out to those locations or get the agents in those locations to determine those individuals' location when this event occurred,
And
so that we could try to get rid of some of them. So it was a labor-intensive case.
And there was still a lot of doubt that he was the one up until the end.
Oh, I doubted it.
he
I
was the
doubted it right to
primary
the very
doubter.
end.
You were skeptical.
Yeah, you know, after you've worked, I worked the case longer than these guys, and after a while, it's like you have the suspect of the day, and everybody gets enthused, and you get all of your hopes up, and everything looks good, and then boom. So I learned that you can't get excited about things. You just have to do your job. You have to do the necessary work. And I didn't believe that we had one piece of forensic evidence we were constantly on the lookout for, and that was a circa 1925 to 30 Smith Corona typewriter with pica style type with 2.54 spacing. That was exact from the fourth bomb on. He used that typewriter on every communication, including the writing of the manifesto. We felt if we found that, we'd find our man. So when the manifesto came in and everyone got excited about it because of linguistic comparison and similar spellings and unusual sayings and things like that, you know, I was looking for forensic stuff. I wanted fingerprints, typewriters, tool marks, and so forth. And I wasn't going to get too excited. I'll do my job. I'll do, you know, what I have to do.
So just to tell people who have not yet read the book, when you speak about the manifesto, that was a 35,000-word essay that Kaczynski
Yes.
wrote, which he wanted published in the New York Times, Washington Post, and a lot of other major newspapers. So take us through that. What
He
was
didn't just want it.
He
He
demanded
it.
demanded that unless
or he'd kill again.
it's published, I'll continue killing.
And that created a huge moral challenge for both the newspapers, the media, as well as, I assume, the FBI.
Yes.
And that
Take us
played
through
out.
that. What was the?
That was a very interesting and historic, actually, process in the way that was resolved, because there was no one in the FBI or any of our law enforcement contacts that wanted us to publish the manifesto, because there was good reason, particularly in international terrorism, where you don't want to play ball with the terrorists for fear that they would continue kidnapping other Americans abroad and stuff. But
wouldn't
this is
do
a
that.
domestic terrorist we're dealing with here, lone wolf terrorists. Very much like other criminal cases, and I made the argument that it's very much like a domestic kidnapping, where we deal with and sometimes pay a ransom, or have the victim's parents or family members would pay a ransom to a kidnapper to give us advantage in how we might operationally arrest them and rescue the victim. And we do the same in extortion cases. We play along. So I was very much from the standpoint of saying this is different from the international terrorist reason for that the rule was basically set that you don't talk to or negotiate with terrorists. And we ended up going back to Terry Turchi and I went back to talk to Louis Free, and then he said he was convinced rather easily. We went across to talk to Janet Reno. She was on board, and the very next day then we met with the two of them and the publishers of the Washington Post, the New York Times, and their collective editorial staff. So it was quite an interesting meeting. A lot of tension.
Not the sort of people you think the FBI is meeting with every day.
Exactly. And everyone had their own perspective on this, because everyone was interested in preserving public safety. That was paramount, of course. But we were making the argument that we think the content of the manifesto is someone's lifelong views, and that he would have expressed them at some point in his life, either in a college essay or in letters or in just verbally talking to people, somebody perhaps would say, I've heard that before. And that was the whole premise when we started this thing. That last 2 years of the investigation was engage the public, tell them what we know about the Unabomber so that they might recognize and tell us. And this played right into those hands, right into that category. And fortunately, David Kaczynski, his wife, had to hit him over the head and say, you need to read
David
this.
David Kaczynski was his brother. So.
Yes.
His brother. So this sounds like your brother. It sounds like the letter. She'd never met Ted Kaczynski, but it sounds like what you've been talking
But
about
it took
in the
a
letters
year,
I've
though,
read.
right? Almost a year
Almost
before
a
that
year.
came
Took him from
So you guys
September
must have been
until
wondering-
January.
Right. But it all came down to that meeting in Washington when Washington Post, New York Times, they finally said, and they had issues because they didn't want to be perceived as being in the pocket of the U.S. government and law enforcement and just jumping to our command as well. But they wanted to preserve public safety, and so they agreed to publish. And Washington Post published because it just technically it was easier to do it that way, and the New York Times actually paid the cost. So they shared. It was a joint publication, essentially.
Would you have caught the guy without that manifesto?
Not in a short
Probably
period of
not.
time.
Maybe sometime, but no, it would have been very, very difficult. He was in our files in that massive amount of data that we had accumulated. We had well over 11 million individual records in a mainframe computer of every place that we knew that the Unabomber had been. And of course, Ted Kaczynski had been at the University of California as an instructor. So he was in the database. But when we would ask for data runs from our computer specialist, say, tell us everybody born in the Chicago area during this period of time, went to high school there, graduated from undergraduate school in Utah, and was in graduate school in California, and they would run it, and we would get boxes of printouts. And it was a very slow, tedious, arduous investigation from that standpoint. So if we ever would have gotten to that point, because he was there prior to the critical times that we were interested in. But no.
It's safe to say that David Kaczynski would not have been able to make the linkage between
without it.
the
Without that
manifesto, and he actually went back into his family storage places and retrieved a 1973 essay, 24-page essay, I believe, that Ted Kaczynski had written 20 years previously. He remembered that and said, there's concepts in here that are the same. And then he looked at it and he started doing his own linguistics comparison. And there's words in there, right-handed logician.
Yeah, cool-headed logician.
Cool-headed logician was
for
a
a
phrase
brother
that was used in one and also in
He
the
said his
manifesto.
brother was the only person he ever knew that used that phrase, cool-headed logician, and it's in there several times.
But it took a lot of courage for a brother to turn
Well,
his
but
own.
the brother and his wife went to a friend of his wife's who was an attorney operating as a private investigator for a Chicago law firm, and she got her firm to agree to let her do pro bono work to try to discount him as a suspect, and they couldn't. Then they took the document that Jim's talking about and brought it to a former FBI linguistics examiner for examination to have him compare it to the manifesto to try to exclude him, and he couldn't. He said it's 50-50 or 60-40, whatever. And finally her law firm said, we've done enough work, no more pro bono work. So then she turned to a law school friend of hers, Anthony Basigli, who was a very well-known Washington, D.C. defense attorney and who had been opposite the FBI in a number of cases and who had a good working relationship, adversarial relationship with an FBI agent in Washington, D.C. So he went to that agent, but that agent was no longer in Washington, D.C. He's now in South Carolina, and talked to him about it. And he said, well, I can't do anything in South Carolina for it. I'm not part of the task force. Here's an agent in D.C. that's part of the task force, Molly Flynn, and take that document to Molly Flynn. So Molly got the document that Jim's talking about, and she took it to our laboratory. And our laboratory, in the way they do their examinations, initially, because it was typed on an old typewriter, did the examination, a documents examination, and determined that it wasn't the Smith Corona 1925 to 30 Pica style type with 2.54 spacing, and gave it back to her and said, it's not the guy. And Molly said, I read this, it's the same. So Molly picked up the phone and called one of my counterpart, Joel Moss, in San Francisco, because she knew how big the file was, 59,000 volumes, paper coming back all over the place, said, don't lose this when it comes in. Pay attention to it. I read it. I think the ideas are the same.
Can you take us quickly to that day in Montana? You were both there in the Montana wilderness when you finally caught up with Ted Kaczynski.
Well, we've been in Montana for a few weeks. Everyone thinks that because the brother said, you know, Ted Kaczynski is probably or might be the Unabomber, that just made the case right there, that it was on a silver platter, and it was far from it. What it really gave us was the challenge of working in a rural environment, which I grew up in rural New Mexico, so I know what it's like when the FBI comes to town. Everybody knows it, and that sort of thing.
Anybody comes to town,
Yeah,
everybody
anybody
knows it.
Yeah. So I knew that this investigation, a lot of investigation, had to be conducted in Lincoln, which is in the middle of winter, a few dozen hardy souls. We had to corroborate that Ted Kaczynski could have actually been in Salt Lake City on a certain date when he mailed a package bomb, or that he was in Sacramento when he placed a bomb in a parking lot on a certain date. And we were collecting all these dates. These were the known facts.
So
of
you
the
did all the
Unabomber.
preparatory work. Take us to the point where you went up to that hut.
Well, we had, and we had, along the same lines before we go that Jim said, we had to get a physical description of the cabin. If you're going to search someplace, you just can't say we're going to want to search, tell the court we want to search a cabin somewhere in rural Montana. We had to specifically get a description of the cabin, a specific location for the cabin. And we did all of that very covertly. And then finally, on the day that we detained and finally arrested Ted Kaczynski, Jim put into place the whole.
How did he react? Was he surprised to see you guys?
There was no reaction at first. The three of us, a Forest Service police officer named Jerry Burns, who was a very close working part of our group up there, and without Jerry, we would have had extreme difficulty doing this. Tom McDaniel, who was a senior resident agent there, and myself, walked up a skid road, which Butch Gearing owned. He was skidding logs off the mountain, and left the skid road about 40 yards from his house. And once you enter onto a person's property in the wilderness, you're trespassing. So you have to have permission. So Jerry was in full uniform, and he was hailing Kaczynski as we walked across his property, so giving him knowledge that we were coming. And there was no response from within the cabin. It was just complete silence. And we were beginning to wonder whether or not he was even going to open the door. And finally, when we got up right close to the cabin, I stayed at one corner of the cabin. Jerry went right to the front door, and Tom was behind him. We could hear some rustling around inside, so we knew he was in there and was aware of us. And he opened the door. And Jerry introduced himself because he knew Jerry from town and from back and forth in Lincoln. And he said, "Mr. Kaczynski, Jerry Burns, United States Forest Service, and I have these two gentlemen here from a mining company, and we're looking for your corner posts. We're trying to ensure that when their employees come up here this summer, they stay off of your property as you've requested." And he said, "Well, my corner posts are very clearly marked." And Jerry said, "No, sir, that they're under snow. This was in a box canyon, even though it was April, it was under snow." And he said, "It would be a lot easier if you stepped out and showed us." And the plan had been, if he gets within arm's reach, we're going to grab him because we didn't know what kind of weaponry he had and so forth. And he started to step out of the cabin toward Jerry and got within arm's reach of Jerry. And he hesitated for a moment and turned his head and said something to the effect of, "I need to get my coat," because it was rather cold. And when his attention was diverted, Jerry snatched him and pulled him out of the cabin, and he started wrestling and fighting with Jerry. And big old Tom's a big man, I don't know, 6'4", 250, and he wrapped them all up, and they were scuffling around. And I got the privilege of walking around in front of him, displaying my credentials and my weapon to him, and told him who we were and what we were doing. And he completely complied with every request.
And when you searched the cabin later, you found a live bomb.
We did.
Yes, the
That was
ERT teams
effectively
did.
the-
Yes. Took 9 days to search that little 10 by 12 cabin.
Because we were X-raying everything,
Right.
every box.
And they didn't go in the front door. They cut a hole in the rear of the cabin and came in from above and worked their way down.
So very quickly, in maybe 1 or 2 or 3 key points, what did we learn from the way you caught the guy, and how is it applying to today's terrorism threat? I mean, we do worry about domestic terrorists for sure, although not as much as we
I think he's very similar to what we saw with Eric Freeman in Pennsylvania, with Eric Robert Rudolph, the Olympic bomber in North Carolina, which Terry and I went down and initiated that with the Southeast Regional Bomb Task Force, the Unabomb concept into there to the search for Rudolph. I think you've seen it in Boston to some degree with the Zarnoffs. I think you see that because of the policies that Jim implemented with regard, and Director Free with regard to sharing of information with the public, which we generally didn't do a lot of in the past, coming out and asking for the public's assistance by providing more vital information to them was valuable in all of these cases.
So it's sharing information, being more open with the media?
Being more cooperative with other law enforcement agencies. I think you've seen that with the JTTFs being established after
Joint Terrorism Task Forces.
After the 9/11 thing, which are nothing more than, in my estimation, Unabomb task forces.
What about identifying the types of people who do this? Are they always going to be total mysteries to us when they suddenly appear?
Well, certainly.
Or can we say, there's something that characterizes them?
Certainly each one is unique, but one of the things that I found is really valuable that came out of the Unabomb experience, and that the FBI, I think, has learned, is that there are many resources within the FBI. There was the counterintelligence, foreign counterintelligence resources versus the criminal expertise that was in the FBI, and there was a wall between the two. And I had worked in my career both sides of the fence, so I've well understood the resources over there. And when I inherited the Unabomb investigation, I realized we weren't taking advantage of all the resources and skills that the FBI has. And so with Director Free's approval, without express approval, but this was incorporated where he allowed me to do things like this, as I took, Terry Turchi himself was a foreign counterintelligence expert,
right. Yes.
and I put him into managing essentially what was a criminal case. It was always managed by the Criminal Investigations Division at headquarters. We also changed the way the profiling unit operating out of Quantico was doing, because very much the same way. They were using their resources toward criminal serial murderers, whereas in the intelligence side of the house, they were also using psychologists to assess foreign spies and all. And we actually had those resources in my San Francisco office. And so we weren't happy with the profiling results we were getting, so we took a clinical psychologist, FBI agent in San Francisco, and she gave direct support to our case.
But that seems to be one of a key lesson, if anything, that you could have treated the guy as a criminal, a serial bomber, which he was, or a terrorist. And if you looked at him as a terrorist, that automatically called up different kinds of resources, different kind of reflexes in terms of how you looked at the case. Am I wrong? I mean, is that one of the
No, but I think that's
takeaways
part
that
of the
you get
problems
from-
in law enforcement. We tend to compartmentalize things, and we put things into boxes: domestic terrorists, lone wolves, serial killers, and all those kinds of things. The criminal doesn't think in those terms. They do what they do. And when we start compartmentalizing these, and we don't take the advantage, as Jim said, of the foreign counterintelligence people who are much more, in the past, were much more analytical and introspective as compared with the normal criminal agents, and combine the two, it works a lot better. And I think that's a real good lesson from this.
Okay, well, if we want to find more, not only the gripping story that you guys went through, but learn some of these lessons, I really recommend reading this wonderful book. Thanks both of you for taking the time to be here.
Thank you
for
very
having
much.
us.
When terrorists struck the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001, among the victims were members of the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force. The JTTF was formed partly as a result of the lessons learned from tracking the Unabomber case 5 years before. Some might argue the FBI is still on an upward learning curve, but it now has more sophisticated tools to keep us safe. We owe that to the Unabomber, and more importantly, to the agents who brought him down. I'm Steve Handelman. Thanks for watching. See you next time.